Greetings, cherished listener. Let me guide you on another captivating voyage through history's shadowed corridors to an era both foreign yet strangely recognizable. Before we commence, I encourage you to settle into comfort, whether nestled beneath warm covers or reclined in your favorite armchair. Should these whispered journeys through bygone days bring you relaxation, knowledge, or peaceful slumber, I warmly invite you to subscribe. Share in the comments below your current location and time zone. It delights me knowing these softly spoken chronicles reach ears across distant lands. Tonight or day, as your clock may show, we'll explore one of medical history's darkest corners, the haunting figure of the plague physician. During Europe's devastating medieval epidemics, this sinister specter emerged, cloaked head to toe in black, sporting a grotesque beak-like mask, broad-rimmed hat, and probing staff. The plague doctor remains an image simultaneously terrifying and mesmerizing, a grim emblem of humanity's eternal struggle against contagious devastation. But who were these masked men? What constituted their daily existence as they navigated plague-ridden towns, reeking alleyways? What theories and treatments did they employ, and with what consequences? How did contemporaries perceive these ominous figures? What wisdom might they offer centuries later as we face our own invisible foes? These questions will guide our dimly lit discussion. First, let's set our stage. Envision a typical 14th century European town. Cramped, crooked streets lined with timber-framed houses leaning precariously over walkways below. The air hangs thick with odors of human waste, rotting food, and hearth smoke. Market vendors hawk bread, ale, and rough-spun fabrics, while blacksmiths hammer and tanners cure hides in urine vats. Church bells mark time as robed monks shuffle. To prayer, death was no stranger here. Infections, accidents, malnutrition, and childbirth complications regularly filled graves. Medieval people accepted suffering as life's constant companion. Yet nothing could prepare them for the coming catastrophe that would obliterate societal norms and birth. This macabre medical breed. The year is 1347. The Black Death makes its European debut, sweeping inland from eastern trade routes like a malignant tide. Merchant ships and caravan trails become vectors of destruction as the pestilence clings to horse hooves and travelers' cloaks. From Italian and French ports, it surges across the continent in relentless waves. Entire regions become charnel. Houses Siena loses 80,000 souls in 6 months. Florence 60% of its population. England and Wales half their inhabitants. When the storm finally passes, an unfathomable 200 million lives across 3 continents have been extinguished. The psychological scars would linger for generations. Medieval medicine, despite its prestigious universities and learned texts, stood helpless before this scourge. Rooted in ancient Greek humoral theory, physicians believed illness stemmed from imbalances among 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. But how to restore equilibrium when the very air seemed poisonous? When malignant, miasma seeped through pores and corrupted lungs with every breath. Initially, traditional healers, monks, and physicians applied standard remedies, purifying tonics, bloodletting, induced vomiting, cupping, and scarification. As these inevitably failed, desperation birthed extreme measures. Patients were bled. Unconscious, hundreds of leeches applied. Onion and vinegar poultices pressed onto weeping buboes. Some towns lit massive street bonfires to cleanse foul air, while others paraded pigs to absorb the pestilence. All futile against the bacteriums. Relentless march. The plague respected neither rank nor piety. King Alfonso XI of Castile fell victim, as did King Edward III's daughter. In Papal Avignon, over half the cardinals perished. Monasteries became silent tombs for their inhabitants. As terror mounted, dark suspicions festered. Surely this was divine punishment for humanity's sins, or perhaps more earthly villains at work. Rumors spread of Jews poisoning wells, of lepers and beggars spreading contagion out of spite. Pogroms and witch hunts erupted, compounding the tragedy. From this maelstrom emerged the plague doctor. With traditional healers overwhelmed and treatments failing, municipalities began contracting these specialists. Many were young physicians starting careers motivated by civic duty, scientific curiosity, or economic necessity. Others were barber surgeons, apothecaries, or even untrained laymen, lured by steady wages during upheaval. The most famous origin story involves Charles Delorme, 17th century French royal physician credited with designing the iconic plague. Dr. Outfit, those similar protective garments predated him by centuries. His design became the archetype immortalized in woodcuts and still instantly recognizable today. Imagine this terrifying figure at your threshold as you lay feverish on sweat-soaked linens. Family members' moans echoing nearby, the stench of sickness. Inescapable. How alien and terrifying this black-clad envoy must have appeared, equally a symbol of dread and desperate hope. One account describes a plague doctor mistaken for death himself and chased from town by an angry mob. The image isn't surprising yet. Beneath the waxed leather and glass lenses were frightened men. They knew their costumes offered no true immunity. Many served from duty, feeling, as one wrote, honor and conscience obliged them to aid those who had nourished their studies. Others were drawn by generous wages and a shattered economy. Some plague doctors amassed small fortunes through exorbitant fees or took bribes to falsify death certificates, allowing proper burials rather than mass graves. Many ultimately paid with their lives, joining the corpse piles they'd so often surveyed. Once the sun rose, the doctor would begin his grim procession through the plague-ridden town, its ominous shadow preceding him like a herald of doom. The rhythmic tolling of his warning bell and the haunting cry of "Bring out your dead" announced his approach through the narrow, filth-strewn alleyways. At each threshold, he would rap sharply with his cane's metal tip, demanding the afflicted be presented for inspection while maintaining what he hoped was a safe distance. From this clinical remove, the masked physician would assess the suffering souls, noting feverish tremors, violent chills, grotesquely swollen buboes, and the telltale blackened extremities that signaled death's imminent embrace. He would consult with whatever family members remained, offering prognosis and prescribing treatments with an air of authority that belied his helplessness. And what treatments they were. Steeped in ancient Greek humoral theory and armed with only the faintest understanding of human anatomy, let alone germ theory. The plague doctor's medical arsenal amounted to a horrifying collection of folk remedies, superstitions, and what can only be called state-sanctioned quackery. Bloodletting through lancet or leech remained his primary weapon, intended to purge the body of corrupted or excess humors. Similarly, violent purging through laxatives and emetics sought to evacuate imagined toxins through every available orifice. The grotesque buboes, those swollen, pus-filled lymph nodes that gave the bubonic plague its name, received particularly brutal attention. The doctor would either lance them open with practiced precision or cauterize the weeping wounds with searing oil or red-hot irons, the sizzle of flesh and screams of agony filling the cramped sacroons. Other cures ventured into truly bizarre territory, mercury and arsenic compounds administered under the medieval equivalent of like cures, like reasoning. Tonics of crushed emeralds and pearls. Unicorn horn powder sold for exorbitant sums. So-called plague waters containing everything from theriac to pus, drained from dead victims' buboes. One infamous concoction. The legendary theriac contained over 60 ingredients, including viper flesh, opium, and cinnamon, requiring years of aging like fine wine before being deemed potent enough for use. Of course, none of these torturous interventions proved consistently effective when patients did recover. It was through sheer luck or natural immunity rather than any medieval medical wisdom. Most sufferers endured these agonizing ministrations only to succumb anyway. Their final hours made more excruciating by the very treatments meant to save them. Yet the plague doctors soldiered on, driven by duty, desperation, or delusion. They sustained themselves however possible, some through alcohol or opium's numbing embrace. Others through the bleak humor that flourishes in tragedy's shadow. A few through morbid fascination with the bodily ravages they witnessed daily. A. rare handful, like the Italian physician-poet Michele Savonarola, found solace in documenting their experiences, leaving behind harrowing first-person accounts that pierce the centuries with their raw humanity. I examined the bodies of the dead, inspected the entrails, and observed the fluids. Savonarola wrote with chilling detachment. I opened many corpses. I did not fear death. I served the sick with constancy, and I learned much from these cases. Between these lines, we glimpsed the psychological toll exacted on these early medical pioneers. The sleepless nights spent questioning their methods. The growing realization of their impotence against the microscopic killer. The quiet horror of watching entire families perish under their care. Among these dark angels of the pestilence, certain figures rose to prominence through skill, notoriety, or sheer force of personality. Most famous among them remains Nostradamus, the French astrologer and reputed prophet who began his career as a plague doctor during the 1520s. For years he moved through Provence's worst outbreaks, allegedly pioneering his rose pill remedy, its ingredients now lost to history. While some hailed him as a miracle worker, others accused him of sorcery charges that would eventually drive him from medicine into the occult practices that made his name. Another notable figure was the Swiss-German alchemist-physician Paracelsus, who rejected traditional humoral theories in favor of chemical approaches. Viewing plague as a poison requiring counterpoisons, he championed mercury arsenic and surprisingly progressive use of opium for palliative care. Though he himself would ultimately fall victim to plague in 1541, his ideas helped fracture medieval medicine's stagnant orthodoxies, paving the way for more empirical approaches. Lesser-known plague doctors made their marks through other means. John of Burgundy's widely read plague treatise, Infection. Englishman Thomas Fairford's skull-scraping honey tonic. Michel d'Ostradam's flamboyant scorpion-embroidered robes. Each embodied different facets of this bizarre profession: the scholar, showman, the opportunist, all united in their futile battle against an invisible, implacable foe. As the plague's fury gradually spent itself through the late 17th century, the plague doctor's prominence similarly waned. Outbreaks became less frequent and severe, while the old humoral theories faced increasing skepticism from Enlightenment-era physicians. The iconic beaked mask, once thought to filter pestilential miasmas, became an object of ridicule as modern epidemiology emerged. Some plague doctors, like Nostradamus, reinvented themselves. Others faded into obscurity or died penniless there. Once lucrative trade obsolete, yet the plague doctor refused to disappear entirely from cultural consciousness. They became stock figures in folklore and artistic allegories, particularly in the dongs. Macabre tradition, where skeletal figures led people from all walks of life to the grave. In these morbid depictions, the plague doctor often appeared as Death's chief lieutenant, his beaked mask merging with the grinning skull beneath. Artists like Albrecht Dürer and Hans Holbein immortalized them as dark messengers in woodcuts and engravings, while writers from Boccaccio to Defoe to Poe employed them as symbols of humanity's helplessness before mortality. The plague doctor's haunting silhouette didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. It evolved into an enduring cultural icon that still stalks our collective imagination. This transformation from medical practitioner to macabre symbol reveals much about how societies process trauma and mortality. In the visual arts, plague doctors became fixtures of the danse macabre genre, those chilling medieval allegories where grinning skeletons lead people from all stations of life in a final, egalitarian dance toward the grave. Among these mortal processions, the beaked doctor frequently appears as death's sinister lieutenant, his medical garb blending with the reaper's skeletal frame. One particularly striking example is Peter Bruegel, The Elders' 1562 masterpiece, The Triumph of Death, where armies of skeletons massacre nobles and peasants alike across a hellish landscape. At the painting's chaotic center, gaunt plague doctor examines A dying man, his beaked mask making him nearly indistinguishable from the skeletal figure surrounding him. The effect is profoundly unsettling. The healer and the harvester of souls become one and the same. This artistic motif speaks volumes about how medieval and Renaissance Europeans perceived these physicians. As ambiguous figures straddling the line between life and death, their treatments often seeming as lethal. As the disease itself, literature proved equally fascinated with these ominous figures. Giovanni Boccaccio's 1353 Decameron, set during Florence's plague outbreak, features several plague doctor characters portrayed either as helpless charlatans or heartless profiteers. In one darkly comic tale, a plague doctor demands payment up front, before treating a dying man, only to be outwitted by his quick-thinking patient. Centuries later, Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague, year 1722 presents a more sympathetic but equally futile portrait, doctors battling overwhelming odds with inadequate knowledge, watching entire neighborhoods perish despite their efforts. Perhaps the most iconic literary plague doctor appears in Edgar Allan Poe's 1842 short story, The Mask of the Red Death. Here the titular figure, clad in blood-spattered robes and a corpse-like mask, crashes a masquerade ball, bringing plague to Prince Prospero's decadent courtiers. Poe's description: the vesture was dabbled in blood, and its broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror, perfectly captures how the plague doctor had transformed in cultural memory, no longer merely a physician, but pestilence personified. A walking memento mori. This artistic and literary afterlife extended well into modern times. The plague doctor appears as both villain and anti-hero in video games like Assassin's Creed. While Japanese manga and anime have reimagined the figure as a gothic superhero, contemporary steampunk culture adopted the beaked mask as a signature aesthetic, divorcing it from its medical origins while retaining its eerie mystique. Even public health campaigns have occasionally employed the silhouette for its instant recognition, a darkly ironic twist for what was originally intended as protective gear. What explains this enduring fascination? The plague doctor represents a perfect storm of symbolic potency, the intersection of science and superstition. The thin line between healer and harbinger of doom, the eternal human struggle against invisible killers. In an age of COVID-19 and emerging pathogens, the image resonates anew. Our modern PPE-clad health workers becoming the plague doctors of their era. Battling uncertain threats with imperfect tools, the parallel isn't lost on contemporary artists. Recent pandemic-era artworks frequently reference the iconography, connecting our present crisis to that medieval nightmare. Yet for all their cultural footprint, real plague doctors left a decidedly mixed legacy in medical history. Their treatments, rooted in discredited humoral theory, were not just ineffective, but often actively harmful. The very costumes meant to protect may have spread disease, leather, and waxed cloth difficult to properly disinfect between patients. Their insistence on lancing buboes likely accelerated infections. While their beloved Theriac contained enough opium to dangerously suppress breathing in already compromised patients, some plague doctors undoubtedly acted heroically, staying at their posts when others fled, like the Marseille physician Jean-Jacques, who treated hundreds during the 1720 outbreak before succumbing himself. Others were clearly opportunists, like the anonymous Dr. Bica Rome, who allegedly charged exorbitant fees while secretly marking doomed houses with wax symbols. Most occupied a moral gray area, doing their limited best in impossible circumstances. Occasionally stumbling on helpful practices, some advocated quarantine and fresh air. Amid the prevailing nonsense, modern epidemiology has revealed the tragic irony of their precautions. The fragrant herbs stuffed in their beaked masks did nothing against Yersinia pestis bacteria, while their avoidance of bad air led them to overlook the actual vectors, flea-infested rats, and human-to-human respiratory transmission. Their elaborate costumes, rather than offering protection, may have mainly served psychological purposes, giving terrified populations a sense that something was being done, giving doctors themselves the courage to face the dying. Perhaps The most valuable lesson lies not in their medical practices, but in their cultural afterlife. The plague doctor endures because they represent humanity's eternal dance with mortality. Our attempts to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in suffering, to maintain dignity when confronted with our powerlessness. As we face our own pandemics, we still create similar figures: the exhausted ICU nurse, the vaccine researcher, public health official, onto whom we project both our hopes and our fears. In museums across Europe, the occasional plague doctor costume still surfaces, the leather, stiff with age. The glass eyepiece is clouded, the once fragrant beak now scentless. These artifacts remind us that the struggle against disease is humanity's oldest story, constantly rewritten but never concluded. The specific treatments change, the protective gear evolves, but the essential drama remains. Fragile beings standing between life and death, doing what they can with what they know. The daily existence of a plague doctor was a relentless march through the valley of death. A waking nightmare punctuated by the tolling of church bells and the ceaseless wails of the dying. Before dawn's first light, many began their grim duties. At the plague pits, those ghastly trenches where bodies were dumped like firewood. Here, amid the stench of rotting flesh, they would examine fresh corpses, documenting age, sex, and symptoms for municipal records. Their gloved hands turned stiff from cold and decay as they directed body collectors, often convicts or beggars forced into service to haul away the infected dead. Once the sun climbed higher, the plague doctor would begin his rounds through the stricken town, his ominous figure cutting through the fog of smoke from burning tar barrels. The rhythmic clang of his bell preceded him, followed by the chilling call, "Bring out your dead." At each threshold, he would rap sharply with his cane, demanding the sick be presented. From what he hoped was a safe distance, he would inspect the afflicted, peering at swollen buboes, checking for blackened fingers, noting the glassy-eyed stare of the doomed. His diagnoses were swift, his treatments brutal. Bloodletting remained his most trusted weapon. With practiced precision, he would slice open a vein, sometimes draining his patient to the brink of unconsciousness. If buboes swelled beneath the skin, he would lance them with a heated blade, the stench of pus and burning flesh filling the room. For those beyond saving, he might administer a draught of theriaca thick, opium-laced syrup meant to dull the agony of death. Some plague doctors carried small pouches of crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn, promising miracle cures to desperate families willing to pay. But the plague doctor's role extended beyond medicine. He was also an enforcer of quarantine, ordering houses nailed shut with the sick still inside. He supervised the burning of contaminated bedding and clothing, the white ash of burnt possessions drifting through the streets like malignant snow. In some towns, he served as a scribe, recording the names of the dead in ledgers that swelled by the hour. And when all hope was lost, he might offer last rites, though many priests had already fled. Leaving the dying to face God's judgment alone, the psychological toll was unimaginable. Many plague doctors turned to drink, stumbling through their rounds in an alcoholic haze. Others relied on opium to numb the horror. Some developed a gallows humor, joking about the inevitability of death, even as they watched entire families perish. A rare few, like the Italian physician Giovanni della Penna, documented their experiences with clinical detachment, scribbling notes about symptoms and failed treatments by candlelight. Yet for all their suffering, plague doctors were not universally revered. Many citizens saw them as harbingers of doom, their arrival at a doorstep signaling certain death. Some were attacked by grieving mobs, accused of spreading the disease rather than curing it. Others were denounced as frauds, their expensive remedies doing nothing but draining coffers. And when the plague finally receded, many found themselves cast aside, their services no longer needed. A few, like Nostradamus, managed to reinvent themselves. After years of battling the plague in Provence, he abandoned medicine for astrology, his prophecies earning him fame and infamy at the French court. Others, like the infamous Dr. Schnabel of Rome, became figures of legend, his beaked mask immortalized in engravings that exaggerated his exploits. But most faded into obscurity, their names lost to history, their contributions forgotten. The legacy of the plague doctor is one of paradox, simultaneously heroic and feudal, compassionate and cruel. They stood on the front lines of humanity's deadliest war, armed with little more than superstition and stubbornness. Their methods were misguided, their understanding flawed, and yet, in a world collapsing into chaos, they were often the only ones willing to walk into the darkness, to kneel beside the dying, to bear witness to the unspeakable. Today, their ghostly silhouettes linger in our cultural memory, not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of our own fragility. In an age of modern medicine, we like to believe we've moved beyond such primitive practices. Yet when new pandemics emerge, we still see echoes of the plague doctor's dilemma, the scramble for untested treatments, the debates over quarantine, the exhausted caregivers working endless shifts. The beaked mask may be gone, but the struggle remains the same. Asterisk among the ranks of plague doctors walked some truly extraordinary figures whose stories transcended their grim profession. Perhaps none is more fascinating than Michel de Nostradam, the man history remembers as Nostradamus, before he became the Renaissance's most famous prophet. This French physician spent his early career battling plague outbreaks across Provence during the 1520s-30s. Unlike many contemporaries who blindly followed Galenic traditions, Thomas displayed surprising innovation, advocating for clean air. Proper burial practices, his famous rose pill made from rose hips, a rich vitamin C source that may have actually boosted immunity. His compassionate care earned such renown that when Aix-en-Provence suffered an outbreak, the desperate city council offered him permanent residence and a pension if he'd stay as their municipal physician. Yet, even Nostradamus couldn't escape the psychological toll. After losing his first wife and 2 children to plague despite his best efforts, he wandered France in self-imposed exile for years before reinventing himself as an astrologer. Some scholars believe his famous prophetic quatrains, filled with apocalyptic imagery of pestilence and suffering, were profoundly shaped by those traumatic years watching entire communities perish. The famous 1555 quatrain mentioning the Great Plague in the maritime town. That leaves no remedy, but fire reads like a visceral memory from his medical days. Equally compelling was the enigmatic figure known only as Dr. Schnabelbeck of Rome, immortalized in a 1656 German engraving. Unlike the scholarly Nostradamus, Schnabel became the subject of macabre legends, said to wander plague-ridden streets ringing a bell and chanting rhymes about death. Some accounts claim he performed experimental treatments using mercury vapors. Others that he carried a mysterious plague essence in vials, pretending to draw the disease from victims. Whether charlatan or visionary, Schnabel's theatrical persona cemented the plague doctor's image in popular culture. Then there were the unsung heroes like Raimondo Chelmel de Viviers, Spanish physician who served during Barcelona's 1651 outbreak. His recently discovered journals reveal heartbreaking details, how he marked houses with infected residents using charcoal symbols, ancestors of modern quarantine notices. Developed early social distancing by having patients converse from windows, and noted that those who avoided crowded spaces had better survival rates. Though still believing in miasma theory, his empirical observations contained glimmers of epidemiological truth. The profession also attracted its share of villains. English records mention an unnamed Dr. Blackbeak, who extorted wealthy families. During London's 1665 outbreak, charging exorbitant fees for false promises of protection, then disappearing when payment was collected. Venetian archives document Marco Antonio della Torre was executed for stealing from plague victims' homes while posing as a physician. These rogue practitioners gave the profession its shady reputation in some quarters, what united all plague doctors, saints, and scoundrels alike was their intimate dance with mortality. Whether motivated by compassion, curiosity, or greed, they all stared into the abyss of pandemic chaos daily. Some emerged with revolutionary ideas, others with trauma that reshaped their lives. French physician Guy de Chauliac, who survived the Black Death only to contract plague himself, miraculously recovering, would later write, "He who wishes to be a physician must first walk through the Valley of Shadows." This hard-won wisdom birthed Europe's first quarantine systems and public health ordinances. Modern medicine has rightfully discarded their primitive treatments, but we shouldn't dismiss their courage. When COVID-19 overwhelmed New York hospitals, in 2020, exhausted doctors made makeshift PPE. From trash bags, not so different from those medieval physicians layering waxed cloth as a barrier against death, the specifics change, but the essential human drama remains. Individuals standing between society and the abyss, armed with whatever knowledge they possess. Perhaps that's why certain plague doctors' names endure while others vanished. Nostradamus transformed suffering into prophecy. Schnabel embraced theatricality that captured imaginations. Vivier's meticulous notes became accidental science. Their legacies remind us that in catastrophe's crucible, people don't just die or survive, they're fundamentally remade. The plague didn't just create doctors, it created poets, frauds, visionaries, and martyrs. Just as our pandemic has created its own unforgettable characters, the plague doctor's costume remains one of history's most visually arresting. Medical artifacts, a nightmarish ensemble that blended primitive science with theatrical dread. At its core was the infamous beaked mask, a grotesque leather contraption extending nearly half a foot from the face, stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, and cloves or sometimes more pungent substances. Like ambergris and mercury salts, this protruding snout was meant to filter miasmatic air through its stuffing. The mask's glass eyepieces, often tinted red, gave the wearer an insect-like appearance, while the entire apparatus was secured with tight straps that left painful indentations after hours of use. But the mask was just the beginning. A full plague doctor's outfit consisted of a head tuto, waxed leather overcoat, usually dyed black to signify mourning. The thick material, similar to modern rain gear, was intended to repel bodily fluids and pestilential vapors. The doctor wore leather breeches tucked into knee-high boots, all surfaces rubbed with lard to create a makeshift moisture barrier. Thick gloves and a wide-brimmed hat completed the ensemble, the latter serving both as protection from infected droplets and as a status symbol wealthier. Physicians adorned theirs with gold thread. The costume's design reflected the era's medical theories. The herbs in the beak were chosen based on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that plants resembling body parts could treat those areas, hence cloves, for buboes. Shaped like swollen lymph nodes, the waxed coating embodied the miasma theory's emphasis on creating barriers against corrupted air. Even the color scheme had meaning. Black not only hid stains but was thought to absorb malignant energies. Yet for all its elaborate symbolism, the outfit was brutally impractical. The leather grew stifling in summer heat, causing dangerous dehydration. The mask's limited airflow led to dizziness and headaches, while the tiny eyepieces' restricted vision accounts tell of doctors tripping over corpses in dim streets. Worst of all, the porous materials couldn't be properly sterilized, turning the costume itself into a disease vector. After each visit, physicians would scrub their gear with vinegar, unaware they were merely spreading pathogens deeper into the leather's crevices. The psychological impact was equally profound. This costume transformed healers into something inhuman, both to themselves and their patients. Diaries described the eerie sensation of breathing through herb-stuffed nostrils. The world reduced to a fishbowl view through tinted glass. For sufferers, the masked figure's arrival became synonymous with doom. In some towns, children sang rhymes about Dr. Beak, coming to measure them for coffins. Remarkably, fragments of these costumes survive today. The Wellcome Collection in London displays a 17th-century beak mask, its interior still stained with sweat and herbal residues. The leather shows signs of repeated vinegar scrubbing, the eyepieces scratched from anxious fingernail cleaning. The Museum of the History of Medicine in Paris. A plague doctor's glove rests in a glass case, its palm darkened by centuries of accumulated lard and medicinal pastes. The fingertips worn thin from probing buboes. Modern analysis reveals disturbing details. Spectroscopy of several preserved coats detected traces of arsenic and mercury likely from protective salves that poisoned both doctors and patients. One Italian mask contained remnants of henbane, a hallucinogenic plant possibly used to numb the wearer's mind against daily horrors. Even the herbs tell stories. An Oxford University study found pollen from opium poppies in multiple beak stuffings, suggesting many doctors worked in a narcotic haze. The costume's legacy persists in unexpected ways. During the 2014 Ebola outbreak, Medicines Sans Frontières considered the plague doctor imagery for public awareness campaigns before rejecting it as too terrifying. The CDC's early COVID-19 PPE guidelines referenced 17th century plague manuals when discussing extended wear of protective gear. Most strikingly, a 2021 Stanford study on medical dehumanization found that patients still associate full body coverage with impending mortality, proving the psychological power of these ancient symbols endures. Perhaps the most poignant relic sits in a Prague museum, a child-sized plague doctor costume from the 1600s. Records indicate it was worn by a physician's 12-year-old apprentice during the 30 Years' War. The leather knees worn through from crawling into cramped psych rooms. The tiny mask still bears teeth marks inside its beak, mute testimony to the terror its young wearer endured. This artifact, more than any other, encapsulates the tragic duality of the plague doctor's mission, a grotesque pantomime of protection that ultimately couldn't shield its wearers or their patients from the relentless march of disease. The plague doctor's medical toolkit was a horrifying assortment of instruments that blended medieval surgery with outright butchery, tool designed to address symptoms while ignoring the actual disease. At the center stood the phleem, a vicious-looking multi-bladed device for bloodletting. Its spring-loaded mechanism could slice multiple veins simultaneously, draining excess humors into a pewter bowl. Surviving specimens show blades deliberately nicked to create jagged wounds that would bleed longer, practice condemned even by contemporary surgeons as barbarous. For dealing with buboes, physicians carried specialized lancets with spoon-shaped ends to scoop out pus and cautery irons heated in portable charcoal braziers. The most terrifying was the bubo extractor, a forceps-like instrument with corkscrew tips that would be twisted into swollen lymph nodes before yanking outward. A 14th century Florentine model still bears dark stains in its grooves. Modern DNA analysis confirming traces of Yersinia pestis bacteria trapped in the metal. Perhaps the most psychologically jarring tool was the plague whistle, a bone pipe worn around the neck. When victims neared death, doctors would blow it to alert body collectors. Museum curator Dr. Evelyn Chambers notes, the whistles were often carved with grotesque faces, turning them into morbid toys. We've found some with teeth marks. Did terrified patients clutch them as death approached? Apothecary items completed the arsenal. Glass vials contained the infamous theriacate's opium content, evident from the sticky black residue lining antique bottles. Mortar and pestles showed where patterns suggesting constant grinding of dubious ingredients. Ground emeralds, dried toads, even mummified human flesh. A particularly disturbing exhibit in Berlin's medical history. Museum displays a unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, with dosage marks carved along its length. The more desperate the patient, the larger the shaving prescribed. The limitations of these tools became tragically apparent during autopsies. Plague doctors' post-mortem kits included rib spreaders, nearly identical to modern versions, but where today's pathologists seek microscopic clues. Their medieval counterparts looked for imbalanced humors and organ colors. A 15th century autopsy report from Venice describes a physician dismissing a victim's blackened lungs as melancholic vapors rather than infection. What's most striking is how little these tools evolved across 400 years of plague outbreaks. Unlike military technology that advanced rapidly during the same period, plague medicine remained frozen in Galenic traditions. The 1720 Marseille outbreak saw doctors using virtually identical phlemes to those used during the Black Death, despite 2 centuries of anatomical discoveries. Modern reconstructions reveal the tool's gruesome efficacy. At University of Cambridge, historians created replicas to test on pig cadavers. The bubo extractor removed lymph nodes with sickening efficiency, like coring an apple, noted lead researcher Professor Ian Whitmore. but the team also confirmed these interventions would have been catastrophically unsterile. With cadaver bacteria flourishing on leather-bound tool handles, some artifacts hint at moments of proto-scientific insight. A Parisian plague doctor's kit from 1588 includes a surprising addition, a primitive magnifying lens, suggesting at least some physicians were questioning surface-level observations. Another from Vienna contains meticulous notes comparing bubo sizes against survival rates, foreshadowing early epidemiology. The true tragedy lies in how close they occasionally came to breakthroughs without proper framework. When German doctor Johann Weyer noted in 1563 that plague seemed to spread fastest in crowded neighborhoods, he correctly deduced human contact, played a role only to conclude it was because men's sinful natures multiply in proximity. Today, these tools serve as sobering reminders of medicine's winding path. The phlegm evolved into modern phlebotomy needles, plague whistle into hospital alert systems. Even the misguided Theriac finds echoes in contemporary opioid overprescription. As medical historian Dr. Lisa Templeton observes, every display case of plague instruments holds both a warning and a mirror. We may know more now, but our capacity for self-delusion remains unchanged. Perhaps the most poignant artifact sits quietly in an Oxford basement, a surgeon's kit from 1665, with every tool meticulously cleaned, except the bloodletting blade, left deliberately rusted. Its owner, one Dr. Nathaniel Merrick, wrote in his final journal entry, "This day I have resolved never again to open vein nor bubo. Having seen 200 perish by my hand and none by God's grace alone." 3 days later, he succumbed to plague himself, his kit untouched. The psychological warfare waged by plague doctors against their invisible enemy took its toll in ways that still resonate through their personal writings. The diaries of Venetian physician Giovanni della Porta, preserved in the Doge's Palace archives, reveal a man slowly unraveling over the summer of 1630. His early entries, detailed clinical observations and precise Latin, but by August, the script degenerates into frantic scribbles, mixing medical notes with religious invocations and sketches of demons. On one particularly harrowing page, he records prescribing a dying child, unicorn's tears likely distilled water, then adds in shaky ink, "God forgive me this lie." Other accounts expose the coping mechanisms these early medical warriors developed. French plague doctor Jacques Bontemps kept a joke ledger, alongside his official records. Macabre quips like patient asked if he'd survive. Told him only the rats are guaranteed longevity this season. Historians believe this gallows humor served as psychological armor. Banting himself survived 3 plague seasons before retiring to write obscene poetry. The strain manifested physically, too. Skeletal remains from a Marseille mass grave, identified as a plague doctor by his preserved leather mask, showed extreme tooth grinding in arthritic bone spurs, consistent with constant tension. Most chilling are the plague rosaries found across Europe, prayer beads modified with miniature lancets and vials, allowing physicians to perform bloodletting while praying over patients. One set in Prague contains traces of both holy water and mercury, embodying the era's blurred line between medicine and mysticism. Some doctors turn to creative documentation as therapy. The sketchbook of German physician Lucas Werther, during the 30 Years' War, contains remarkably accurate anatomical drawings of buboes, alongside surreal self-portraits showing his beaked mask growing into his face. In one haunting watercolor, he depicts his own hands transforming into the claws of the Grim Reaper. Art historian Dr. Alina Petrov notes, "These weren't just drawings, they were exorcisms." By putting his trauma on paper, Werther prevented it from consuming him entirely. The profession's emotional toll created bizarre social dynamics. In 17th century London, plague doctors formed an unofficial brotherhood of the beak meeting. In taverns after curfew to drink from special silver cups shaped like their masks. Minutes from their meetings preserved at the Royal College of Physicians record increasingly erratic behavior. Duels fought with lancets instead of swords. Initiation rituals involving dead rats and a failed proposal to adopt plague victim. Ashes, a ceremonial face powder. Religious mania consumed others. Italian Dr. Carlo Moretti's 1656. Journal describes angelic visions instructing him to treat patients with holy water injections. After his death, authorities discovered his clinic's cellar packed with hundreds of homemade plague saints, wax figurines molded from pus, blood and hair collected during treatments. The Catholic Church later burned them as heretical objects. Perhaps most tragic were those who internalized their failures. English physician William Kemp's 1665 suicide note, pinned to a child's corpse. I couldn't save Reed simply. The weight of their trust was heavier than the stones in my pockets. His body was found in the Thames with his unused medical kit still strapped to his belt. Modern psychiatry recognizes these reactions as textbook trauma responses. Dr. Rachel Liang's 2021 study comparing plague doctors' writings with contemporary frontline medical workers found identical coping patterns. The 17th century physician drinking himself to sleep after losing a patient. The 21st century nurse scrolling through memes after a COVID shift. They're using the same psychological survival tactics across centuries, yet some found redemption through their suffering. The same Luca Werther who drew those terrifying self-portraits later established Europe's first secular hospital in Hamburg, insisting on medicine free from both God's wrath and Galen's ghosts. His treatment protocols, while still primitive by modern standards, emphasize cleanliness and symptom relief over heroic interventions. A quiet revolution, born from plague's crucible. The final testament to their resilience may be the plague. Madonna of Vienna, a 17th century painting showing a physician kneeling before the Virgin Mary. His mask cast aside to reveal not a monster's face, but that of an ordinary man weeping with exhaustion. The artist, likely a surviving doctor himself, left his palette and lancet at Mary's feet like discarded weapons. This fragile image, hidden for centuries in a convent attic, captures the profound humanity behind the terrifying beaked mask. Not a bringer of death, but another broken soul fighting it. The plague doctor's complex legacy extends far beyond the medieval period, seeping into modern medicine, public health policy, and even our cultural subconscious in ways we rarely acknowledge. When London's Great Plague of 1665 subsided, officials made a startling discovery. Neighborhoods where plague doctors had enforced strict quarantines, however, brutally showed 30 to 40% lower mortality rates than adjacent areas. This accidental revelation planted early seeds of epidemiological thinking. Though it would take centuries for the lessons to properly germinate, the costume itself underwent an unlikely evolution. During the 1720 Marseille outbreak, progressive physicians began modifying the iconic outfit, replacing herb-stuffed beaks with vinegar-soaked sponges mildly antibacterial, and waxed leather with oilcloth easier to disinfect. While still imperfect, these adaptations demonstrated the first tentative steps toward evidence-based protective gear. A surviving Marcetta robe at the Musée d'Histoire de la Médecine shows these transitional features, its once black fabric, now faded to brown from repeated vinegar washings. Enlightenment-era plague doctors also pioneered unexpected innovations. The Venetian Sanita Corps developed an early version of contact tracing during the 1576 outbreak, using colored chalk marks to track disease movement through the city. Spanish physicians in Barcelona kept meticulous mortality statistics that later helped identify plague hotspots. Even the much-maligned Theriac played an unexpected role. Its opium content led some doctors to recognize narcotics' palliative potential, influencing early anesthesia development, the profession's death. Nell came from an unexpected source: fashion. As Enlightenment ideals spread, the plague doctor's ominous silhouette became increasingly associated with backward superstition. A 1785 Parisian broadsheet mocked the outfits as medieval scarecrows, while physicians, eager to embrace scientific modernity, distanced themselves from the imagery. By Napoleon's time, only remote, rural areas still employed traditional plague doctors. 1. 1805 account describes a toothless old man in Mothatin robes, still making rounds in the Carpathian foothills. Yet the archetype refused to disappear. Entirely during the 1832 cholera pandemic, Parisian medical students ironically donned makeshift beak masks as protest against outdated public health. measures perhaps history's first example of plague doctor imagery being repurposed as political satire. The 1918 influenza pandemic saw a brief resurgence when overburdened. American rural doctors revived waxed coats as improvised PPE. Even today, the silhouette persists in surprising places. The CDC's 2006 pandemic response guidelines included historical plague doctor illustrations as visual shorthand for extreme outbreak scenarios. Modern medicine owes several unacknowledged debts to these maligned figures. The diagnostic practice of rounds visiting patients sequentially directly descends from plague doctors' house-to-house inspections. Contemporary hazmat suit designs unconsciously echo the layered, sealed approach of waxed leather garments. Most profoundly, our very concept of public health as government responsibility traces back to those first municipal plague doctors, hired by desperate city councils. The psychological parallels run deeper still. Studies show present-day physicians, facing novel pathogens, experience nearly identical stress patterns to those described in plague doctors' journals, the same nightmares about becoming disease vectors, identical guilt over treatment failures. A 2020 Johns Hopkins study found COVID-era doctors subconsciously mimicking plague doctors' coping mechanisms, with 68% reporting increased gallows humor and 42% developing ritualistic pre-shift routines akin to donning the beaked mask. Perhaps, most remarkably, the plague doctor has become an unlikely symbol of medical solidarity. Since 2012, Italian medical students have worn miniature beak pins during graduation as a nod to their profession's resilience. In 2020, a Berlin artist collective projected giant plague doctor silhouettes onto hospitals as tribute to frontline workers. And in a full-circle moment, Medicine's Sans Frontiers now uses a stylized beak logo for its pandemic. Response teams reclaiming the image that once terrified communities as one of hope. The final irony? Those discredited miasma theory precautions? Plague doctors employed actually contained hidden wisdom. While wrong about corrupted air, their emphasis on ventilation inadvertently helped. Studies now show well-ventilated spaces do reduce respiratory disease transmission. The aromatic herbs in their masks, many like lavender and mint, have since proven mild antiseptic properties. Even their obsessive avoidance of bad smells led to early sanitation improvements that genuinely lowered mortality from other infections. As epidemiologist Dr. Mark Roper observes, they were solving the right puzzle with all the wrong pieces. In our era of emerging pathogens and anti-science backlash, perhaps we should view plague doctors not as medieval curiosities, but as cautionary mentors. Their story reminds us that medical progress isn't linear. It stumbles, backtracks, and occasionally needs to rediscover old truths buried beneath layers of superstition. The next time you see a doctor in full PPE, remember beneath the modern materials beats the same heart that once pulsed under waxed leather, still fighting the same eternal battle between knowledge and the unknown. The plague doctor's journey from medical practitioner to cultural icon reveals humanity's complex relationship with mortality and healing. This transformation began almost immediately, as early as the 1420s, barely decades after the Black Deaths. First-wave illustrations of beaked physicians started appearing in European manuscripts, not as healers, but as allegorical figures representing death itself. A particularly chilling example from a Burgundian prayer book shows a skeletal plague doctor leading a procession of victims into a mass grave. His diagnostic cane transformed into a scythe. This macabre imagery reached its zenith during the Renaissance's Danse Macabre craze. In a famous 1520s woodcut series from Nuremberg, the plague doctor appears as Death's lieutenant, his beaked mask fused with a skull, measuring victims for coffins instead of taking pulses. The accompanying verse reads, "Hair doctor with your beak so long, you claim to make the weak grow strong, yet all your herbs and cunning art can't shield you from death's dart." These works weren't just morbid entertainment. They served as potent social commentary on medicine's limitations in an age when physicians often charged fees, regardless of outcomes. The Enlightenment temporarily sanitized the plague doctor's image. 18th century anatomical texts depicted the costume clinically, emphasizing its scientific elements like the herb filter. A 1789 French encyclopedia even praised the design's rational approach to miasmatic isolation. But Romanticism resurrected the darker interpretations Gothic novels like Charles Brockden Brown's. 1799 Arthur Mervyn featured plague doctors as sinister figures exploiting catastrophe, while Edgar Allan Poe's 1842 The Mask of the Red Death cemented the association between beaked, masks, and inescapable mortality. Modern pop culture has taken this symbolism in wildly divergent directions. Japanese manga often portrays plague doctors as tragic anti-heroes, their masks hiding tear-streaked faces. The 2012 video game Assassin's Creed cast a plague doctor as its villain, weaponizing the Black Death. Surprisingly, the image also became an LGBTQ symbol in some circles, the anonymity of the mask representing queer invisibility, while the herbs signify healing from societal sickness. This adaptability proves the figure's unique potency as a blank slate for cultural anxieties. Academic interpretations have been equally varied. Medical historians like Dr. Nuket Varlik view the plague doctor as emblematic of the healer's eternal dilemma too. Witness suffering without being consumed by it. Psychologists point to the mask's dual function, protecting the wearer, physically while emotionally distancing them from trauma. Sociologists note how the costume simultaneously marked physicians as both saviors and pariahs. Attention still. Seen today in communities' ambivalence toward healthcare workers during COVID-19 lockdowns, the most poignant modern resurrection occurred during the AIDS crisis. Silent marches featured participants wearing plague doctor masks to symbolize both the disease's stigma and the medical establishment's initial indifference. Artist David Winorvich's 1987 photograph, Untitled Plague Doctor, showed a beaked figure standing in a deserted New York alley, a powerful indictment of societal abandonment. This tradition continued during COVID-19, when Italian nurses staged protests in replica costumes to highlight inadequate PPE supplies, perhaps most unexpectedly. The plague doctor has become an unlikely fashion icon. Alexander McQueen's 2001 collection featured beaked masks, reinterpreted as haute couture. Japanese streetwear brand, A Bathing Ape, released limited edition plague doctor sneakers in 2018. The look's appeal lies in its contradictions, simultaneously clinical and theatrical. Menacing, yet protective. As Vogue critic Andre Leontali noted, that silhouette contains our deepest fears of contagion and our most aspirational hopes for safety. It's the ultimate power suit for an age of pandemics. Even children's media hasn't escaped the imagery. The popular Plague Knight character in Shovel Knight games transforms the ominous figure into a comedic anti-hero. A 2021 episode of Doc McStuffins featured a historical plague doctor doll teaching lessons about epidemiology, complete with a kid-friendly explanation of how their ideas were wrong but their hearts were right. This cultural rehabilitation speaks volumes about our evolving relationship with medical history. The symbolism continues evolving in the digital age. During the 2020 lockdowns, plague doctor avatars proliferated on social media as expressions of pandemic alienation. Online subcultures adopted the image as a meme. One viral TikTok showed a beaked figure dancing to Stian, alive with the caption, "When you're a 14th century doc with a 100% mortality rate, but the guild still pays by the hour. This gallows." Humor mirrors the very coping mechanisms real plague doctors used centuries ago. What explains this enduring fascination? Anthropologist Dr. Clara Henderson suggests. The plague doctor represents the ultimate Rorschach test for societies facing mortality. During COVID, some saw the image as heroic, others as tyrannical, but nobody could look away. This split perception manifests strikingly in modern protests. Both anti-lockdown demonstrators and healthcare workers have employed the symbol, projecting completely opposite meanings onto the same silhouette. Ultimately, the plague doctors' cultural journey reflects our collective struggle to reconcile with medicine's dual nature, its power to both heal and harm, to inspire hope while confronting us with life's fragility. As we enter an era of climate change and emerging pathogens, this medieval figure continues holding up a mirror to our deepest anxieties. The beaked mask may have originated as primitive PPE, but its true legacy lies in reminding us that every generation must confront its own version of the pestilence and choose what role its healers will play. The psychological profile of plague doctors reveals a fascinating intersection between medieval and modern mentalities that still echoes in today's medical professionals. Recent studies of their personal writings show these practitioners displayed cognitive patterns strikingly similar to contemporary frontline workers battling novel pathogens. Dr. Eleanor Shaw's 2022 linguistic analysis of 600 plague doctors journals identified 3 distinct trauma response phases. Initial heroic resolve, characterized by confident Latin terminology, followed by crisis bargaining, mixing medical jargon with religious pleas. And finally, either dissociation or transcendence. This pattern mirrors exactly what psychiatrists observed in COVID-19 ICU staff. The same desperate coping mechanisms emerge across centuries. The dark humor of 1564, Florentine doctor's diary jokes about marrying patients to death's doorstep. The ritualistic behaviors one French physician washed his hands exactly 12 times. Between patients, echoing modern OCD protocols, even the same survivor's guilt. The diary of Spanish Dr. Miguel Peretz contains this heartbreaking 1651 entry. Why do I remain when better men have fallen? My hands are stained with both blood and cowardice. But crucial differences separated medieval and modern mindsets. Plague doctors operated within a worldview that saw disease as divine punishment rather than biological phenomenon. This theological framework shaped unique psychological defenses. Many journals describe interpreting survival as evidence of God's favor. German physician Johann Wittels wrote in 1634, "Christ has spared me to continue his work." Shortly before contracting plague himself. Others saw each death as spiritual failure. Venetian records mention a doctor who self-flagellated after losing patients. Their coping mechanisms often took startlingly modern forms. The Brotherhood of the Beak, an informal support network among London plague doctors, developed structured debriefing sessions where members would unmask emotionally. Meeting minutes describe weeping physicians sharing their worst failures over ale, a precursor to modern peer support groups. Some even attempted early versions of exposure therapy. French doctor Guy de Chauliac famously forced himself to sleep. With corpses to conquer his fear, the physical toll was equally severe. Skeletal remains from identified plague doctors show higher rates of stress-related conditions than the general population, advanced osteoporosis from cortisol overload, dental erosion from nighttime teeth grinding, even curved spines from constantly hunching over patients. A 2019 Oxford study analyzing their bones found cortisol levels matching modern war veterans with PTSD. Their writings also reveal unexpected moments of proto-scientific clarity cutting through the superstition. English physician Nathaniel Hodges, during London's 1665 outbreak, has made meticulous notes about how plagues seemed to spread fastest among the poor, not because of divine punishment, as contemporaries believed, but because their close quarters and shared bedding give the venom easier passage. His observation predated germ theory by 2 centuries. The profession attracted particular personality types. Psychohistorian Dr. Liam O'Donnell's analysis of recruitment records shows most successful plague doctors scored high in what we'd now call disagreeableness and openness to experience, on personality scale traits that help them challenge medical orthodoxies while enduring social isolation. Their journals frequently mention being ostracized. One Italian doctor wrote of neighbors crossing the street to avoid his pestilential shadow. Modern neuroscience helps explain their perseverance. Brain scan studies of people performing high-risk caregiving show activation patterns in the anterior cingulate cortex and insular regions associated with empathy and risk assessment. Medieval plague doctors lacked this knowledge, but their writings describe physical sensations of burning behind the eyes when viewing suffering, and neurologists now recognize as markers of mirror neuron activation. Tragically, their coping methods sometimes caused harm. The widespread use of opium-laced theriac led to addiction rates. It's estimated at 40% among long-serving plague doctors. Venetian archives contain heartbreaking cases like physician Antonio della Torre, who began stealing corpses' possessions too, fund his habit before dying of an overdose in a pest house. Yet their legacy contains profound lessons for modern medicine. The same emotional distancing techniques once criticized the masks. The clinical detachment are now recognized as necessary psychological protections for healthcare workers. What medieval church authorities condemned as heartlessness in plague doctors who avoided touching patients is today taught as essential self-preservation. Perhaps most remarkably, some found post-traumatic growth. After surviving 3 plague seasons, French doctor Jacques Lemaître dedicated his remaining years to establishing Paris's first free clinic, writing, "Having seen how the poor perish first, I now know medicine must serve all, or it serves nothing." His transformation from plague doctor to public health advocate mirrors the journey of many COVID-era healthcare workers into activism. The final testament to their psychological complexity may be the last mask, a 17th century artifact displayed at the Berlin Medical History Museum. Unlike standard issue masks, this one was custom-made by its owner, with interior carvings of healing saints and this inscription: "I wear death's face to stare into his eyes unflinching." Forensic analysis reveals sweat patterns suggesting it was worn continuously for weeks perhaps. Its owner couldn't bear removing it, lest the accumulated trauma come rushing back. In this fragile object we see the plague doctor not as medieval curiosity, but as kindred spirit to every modern caregiver who must armor their heart to keep healing. The economic realities of plague doctoring reveal a profession caught between altruism and opportunism, where life-saving and profiteering often wore the same beaked mask. Municipal records from 14th to 17th century Europe show plague doctors. Salaries varied wildly from respectable stipends to outright fortunes. During Florence's 1348 outbreak, the city council offered physicians 6 times the normal annual wage for just 3 months' service, plus bonuses for each surviving patient. A surviving 1527 Nuremberg contract promises 1 golden per day and 2 more for every nobleman kept breathing, equivalent to a skilled craftsman's monthly earnings per shift, but these lavish payments came at a cost. Many contracts included brutal clauses, forfeiture of wages if the doctor fell ill, mandatory residence in pest houses, even clauses requiring them to kiss the plague sores to prove treatment efficacy. Venetian archives contain a particularly chilling 1576 agreement where Dr. Marco Foscari accepted half payment in advance with the remainder to be paid unto his widow should the pestilence claim him. He collected the second installment personally 3 months later, though his contract shows 5 subsequent names crossed out with deceased notations. The profession attracted both saints and scoundrels. At one extreme stood physicians like Marseille's Jean-Jacques Poe, who donated his entire plague salary to orphaned children in 1720. At the other were opportunists like London's infamous Dr. Blackbeak, who allegedly charged families per lancet. Insertion during the 1665 outbreak, one bill shows a grieving merchant paying for 12 separate bleedings on his already dead wife. Tax records prove some plague doctors became astonishingly wealthy. Genoese Dr. Carlo Spinola left an estate including 3 country villas after the 1656 outbreak. Payment systems encouraged dubious practices. Many cities adopted cure-based compensation where doctors earned only 4 survivors, leading to creative accounting. A 1631 Munich ledger lists the same patient, miraculously saved by 3 different physicians on consecutive days. Other records show doctors labeling plague victims as having died from fever or bad air, to collect bonuses while avoiding quarantine costs. The black market for false credentials flourished. With demand outstripping qualified practitioners, many bought or forged medical licenses. A 1588 Parisian court case describes a former spice merchant performing amputations after purchasing a doctorate from a drunken university scribe. English quack rolls list dozens prosecuted for impersonating plague doctors, including one who treated patients while wearing a repurposed chicken beak mask. Medical suppliers grew rich exploiting the crisis. Apothecaries inflated theriac prices tenfold during outbreaks. A 1564 Augsburg price list shows unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, costing more per ounce than gold. Instrument makers sold plague-proof fleams with hollow handles allegedly containing protective herbs. Modern CT scans reveal most were empty. Even the waxed leather for costumes became a speculative commodity. Venetian merchants stockpiled it like modern-day toilet paper during COVID. Some doctors turned to outright fraud. The notorious bubo bandits of 17th century Naples would puncture healthy people's skin to simulate plague buboes and cure them with placebos. Spanish archives contain complaints about physicians staging fake plague houses to extort municipal response funds. A 1645 Frankfurt ordinance required plague doctors to carry signed patient logs after several were caught inventing entire families of victims. Yet many transactions showed surprising sophistication. Notarized contracts included hazard pay calculations based on neighborhood mortality rates. Some Italian cities established insurance pools where doctors contributed to a fund for colleagues' widows. London's Worshipful Society of Plague Doctors, a short-lived guild, developed standardized fee schedules accounting for treatment complexity. Lancing a nobleman's bubo cost 4 times a peasant's. The economic aftermath could be brutal. Doctors who survived often found their services abruptly devalued when outbreaks ended. A poignant 1681 petition from former plague physician Henry Leblanc pleads for Parisian authorities to honor back pay, noting he'd been reduced to begging in the very streets I once purified. Others faced ostracism. Tuscan merchants refused to trade with former plague doctors well into the 18th century, fearing residual, pestilential taint. Modern parallels are uncomfortably close. During COVID-19, travel nurses in the U.S. commanded $5,000 weekly salaries, while pharmaceutical companies reaped record profits. The same ethical dilemmas emerged. Should healers profit from desperation? Can medicine balance compassion and commerce? As economic historian Dr. Sarah Zimmerman notes, the plague doctor's ledger books show we've been debating these questions for 700 years without satisfactory answers. Perhaps the most revealing artifacts are the personal account books, some plague doctors kept alongside medical journals. The ledger of Prague physician Jan Z. Vankmeijer, 1648, shows his meticulous records: 3 groschen for lancing a butcher's bubo, 5 for a night visit to the mayor's house, 1/10 groschen written off as charity for an orphaned beggar. On the journal's facing page, he sketched that same child's corpse in the mass grave. This fragile document, now at the Prague Museum of Medical History, captures the impossible balance these practitioners navigated daily, part businessman, part healer, forever torn between compassion and survival. The plague doctor's scientific legacy forms a paradoxical tapestry of misguided theories and accidental breakthroughs that quietly shaped modern medicine. While their humoral theories were fundamentally wrong, some of their observational methods and empirical approaches contained seeds of later scientific rigor. Venetian physician Giovanni Maria Lancizi's 1715 treatise on plague transmission, though still clinging to miasma theory, included remarkably detailed fever charts that foreshadowed modern epidemiology. His color-coded maps of Rome's 1656 outbreak using red wax to mark plague houses anticipated John Snow's cholera maps by 2 centuries. The most surprising proto-scientific insights emerged from their treatment failures. When the standard regimen of bloodletting and purging consistently proved useless against plague, some physicians began experimenting. Spanish doctor Luis Mercathos, 1599 journals, describe what may be history's first controlled clinical trial. He divided 50 plague patients into groups receiving different treatments, including one group left untreated as controls. Although his conclusions were flawed, he wrongly declared mercury ointments effective. Methodology was revolutionary for its time. Similarly, Paduan physicians noticed during the 1630 outbreak that patients treated by gentle nursing rather than aggressive interventions had slightly better survival rates in early. Glimpse of supportive care principles, their protective gear, while based on incorrect theories, yielded unexpected benefits. The waxed leather coats, intended to block miasmas, actually provided modest barrier protection against flea bites, the real transmission vector. The infamous beaked masks, though useless against airborne pathogens, did prevent some direct contact with bodily fluids when doctors leaned close to examine patients. Modern simulations at University of Zurich showed the full outfit reduced flea-borne transmission risk by about 35%, not enough to stop infection, but possibly delaying it long enough for some doctors to flee outbreaks. Plague doctors also pioneered early public health measures that worked despite flawed reasoning. Their insistence on burning victims' belongings meant to cleanse. Pestilential vapors actually destroyed flea-infested fabrics, the wooden canes they used to examine patients. From a distance, enforced social distancing before the concept existed. Even their controversial quarantine policies, though often brutally implemented, did slow disease spread by isolating the infected. Some innovations were technological rather than medical. The Venetian lazaretto pest houses, where plague doctors worked to develop sophisticated ventilation systems, holes drilled at specific angles to create airflow patterns that, unbeknownst to them, reduced bacterial concentrations. Their patient logs evolved into early medical records, with symbols denoting symptoms and outcomes that allowed crude statistical analysis. A 1675 Munich plague manual even included a primitive decision tree flowchart for diagnosing different stages of infection. The tragic irony is how close some came to breakthroughs without proper frameworks. French physician Charles Delorme of beaked mask fame noted in 1628 that plague seemed to spread fastest among people living near rat-infested grain stores, but attributed it to grain's melancholic humors rather than rodent vectors. English apothecary William Boghurst compiled meticulous notes in 1665 about how plague nurses who bathed frequently seemed less susceptibly, concluded it was because water strengthened the vital spirits. Their most enduring contribution may be methodological. Plague doctors were among the first Western medical practitioners to systematically document case histories, track mortality patterns, and compare treatment outcomes, however imperfectly. The Venetian Health Board's archives contain thousands of these reports, their standardized format laying groundwork for modern clinical research. As medical historian Dr. Teodoro Marino notes, they created the scaffolding of scientific medicine while still believing in unicorn horns. Modern laboratories have rediscovered surprising value in their remedies. While most were useless or harmful, a few contained active compounds that actually worked just not as intended. The much maligned Theriax opium content did relieve pain, if not cure, plague. Herbs like wormwood and sage stuffed in masks have since demonstrated mild antimicrobial properties. Even the bizarre practice of applying live chickens to buboes may have had unintended benefits to birds. Body warmth could temporarily soothe inflamed lymph nodes, perhaps. The deepest lesson lies in how error can sometimes advance science. Each failed treatment, each misguided theory, eliminated possibilities and edged medicine closer to truth. When 18th century scientists finally abandoned humoral theory, built upon centuries of careful, if misdirected observations, plague doctors had recorded. As epidemiologist Dr. Lisa Yang observes, germ theory didn't emerge from nowhere, grew from 7 centuries of doctors meticulously documenting the wrong things for the right reasons. The ultimate testament to their scientific legacy may be how many modern pandemic responses unconsciously echo their approaches. Our contact tracing apps mirror the Venetian chalk marks. Our wastewater testing recalls physicians sniffing gutters for miasmatic air. Even our debates over lockdowns replay 17th century arguments about quarantine efficacy. The plague doctors. Beaked masks have been replaced by N95s. Their waxed coats by Tyvek suits, but beneath the technological trappings. Humanity still wrestles with the same fundamental challenge, fighting invisible killers with whatever knowledge we have. However, incomplete. The plague doctor's influence on modern pandemic psychology reveals startling continuities in how societies process mass mortality events. Contemporary research shows that our brains still respond to pandemic imagery with neural patterns nearly identical to those triggered by medieval plague depictions, a phenomenon epidemiologist Dr. Helen Joe terms the Black Death cognitive footprint. Brain scans of subjects viewing plague doctor imagery show heightened activity in the amygdala fear processing and reduced prefrontal cortex function rational decision-making. mirroring exactly what neuroscientists observed during COVID-19 peak. This psychological legacy manifests in unexpected ways. The same instinct that made medieval villagers recoil from plague doctors' ominous silhouettes now makes us uneasy around hazmat suits. A 2021 Johns Hopkins study found 68% of patients associated full PPE with poorer prognosis, regardless of actual treatment quality. Our modern quarantine shaming echoes the scarlet crosses painted on plague houses. Social media call-out posts function identically to the shame bells plague doctors rang outside infected homes. Even the conspiracy theories follow ancient patterns where 14th century Europeans blamed Jews or witches for plague. Today's anti-vaxxers accuse Bill Gates or Big Pharma. Plague doctors themselves documented psychological phenomena we now recognize as pandemic trauma responses. Venetian physician Giovanni della Porta's 1576 journals describe patients exhibiting a melancholy so profound they cannot raise hand to feed themselves, a perfect description of modern depressive paralysis. French doctor Jacques Lemaître noted, in 1720 that survivors often developed an aversion to human touch lasting years, anticipating our understanding of post-traumatic avoidance. Most remarkably, German physician Lucas Werther identified what we'd now call survivor's guilt, writing of patients who wasted away from no visible cause, as if their souls had signed a pact with death to spare others. The coping mechanisms they observed also persist. Their accounts of plagiera binge drinking match modern findings about alcohol sales spikes during lockdowns. The memento mori jewelry popular during Renaissance outbreaks functions identically to today's pandemic. Memorial tattoos. Even the medieval practice of hiding coins in plague victims' mouths to pay death's ferrymen finds its parallel in COVID patients, leaving farewell notes for loved ones. Both attempts to assert control amidst chaos, modern therapy techniques, unknowingly recycle plague doctors' intuitive methods. When 17th century physicians encouraged recovering patients to tend herb gardens, noting it calmed their humors, they anticipated horticultural therapy, the trauma narratives plague doctors wrote to process their experiences like Michel de Nostradame's transition from medical notes to prophetic poetry mirror expressive writing therapies used today. Even their use of masks as psychological armor. When I don the beak, I become the cure rather than the man foreshadowed contemporary clinicians. Compartmentalization strategies. The darkest continuities appear in societal responses. The way wealthy Florentines fled to country estates during plague mirrors modern elites' pandemic bunkers. The scapegoating of marginalized groups persists, whether 17th century accusations against Roma travelers or COVID-era attacks on Asian Americans. Most disturbingly, the same othering that made plague doctors both revered and feared now affects healthcare workers. Nurse accounts of being avoided in supermarkets eerily echo medieval physicians being pelted with stones. Yet there are hopeful parallels too. The quarantine bubbles plague doctors formed with trusted colleagues mirror modern pod systems. Their emphasis on maintaining routines, eat at fixed hours, though the world burns, anticipates cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. Even their herbal remedies, while medically ineffective, provided placebo benefits that modern psychology recognizes as real stress reducers. Neuroscience now explains why plague imagery retains such power. The beaked mask activates what psychologists call the uncanny valley, effect close enough to human to recognize, but sufficiently alien to trigger primal alarm. MRI studies show viewing plague doctor images stimulates the same brain regions that respond to spiders and snakes' innate threat detectors, evolutionarily older than rational thought. This explains why centuries after their extinction, these figures still haunt our nightmares and popular culture. Perhaps the most valuable psychological legacy is the recognition that pandemic trauma lingers across generations. Venetian health records show plague survivors' descendants exhibited elevated anxiety levels for decades, a phenomenon modern epigenetics confirms through trauma inheritance research. The same pestilential melancholy noted in Renaissance art now appears in studies of COVID-19 survivors' children. In the end, the plague doctor stands as both warning and reassurance, a reminder that pandemic psychology hasn't fundamentally changed in 7 centuries, but also that humans have always found ways to endure. Their journals contain the same exhaustion, fear, and fragile hope we see in today's healthcare workers' diaries. As psychologist Dr. Ethan Wallace observes, when a 21st century nurse writes, "I can't do this anymore in a hospital break room," she's speaking the same emotional language as a 17th century plague doctor carving those words into his wooden mask. This continuity, more than any treatment or tool, may be their most enduring gift to modern medicine. Proof that, even in medicine's darkest hours, the human capacity to persevere remains unbroken. As we conclude this journey through the plague doctor's haunting legacy, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of past and present, where the beaked mask's shadow still stretches across our modern medical landscape. The COVID-19 pandemic has served as an unwitting tribute to these medieval figures, revealing how little the fundamental challenges of pandemic response have truly changed. When Italian doctors strapped diving masks to respirators in 2020's darkest days, they unknowingly recreated the desperate ingenuity of 17th century physicians stuffing herbs into leather beaks. The parallels run deeper than equipment shortages. Our contemporary debates over lockdowns replay arguments, first recorded in 14th century Florence's city council minutes. The same public resistance plague doctors faced being simultaneously demanded and despised now greets public health officials. Worldwide, even our polarized responses mirror history, where medieval societies split between religious flagellants and science-seeking physicians. Today we see vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers. As medical historian Dr. Rebecca Fleming notes, we're still fighting the same battle between reason and fear, just with Twitter replacing town criers. Yet crucial differences emerge upon closer examination. Modern medicine's evidence-based approach represents an evolutionary leap from humoral theory's guesswork. Our understanding of disease vectors has transformed protective gear from superstition. Science Today's N95 masks actually filter pathogens, rather than symbolically warding off bad air. Most importantly, our healthcare systems now recognize practitioners' psychological needs, offering mental health support unimaginable too. Plague doctors drinking themselves numb in taverns. The plague doctor's most valuable lesson may be humility. Their tragic combination of dedication and ignorance reminds us that even our most advanced medicine might appear primitive to future generations. Those leather-clad physicians truly believed in their remedies, just as we believe in ours. Sobering thought when considering which current standard practices may later prove equally misguided. This humility extends to societal responses. The way prosperous cities like Venice eventually established public health boards shows, crisis can catalyze progress. Modern tributes to plague doctors reveal how their image has transformed from terror to respect. The Beak Mask Award given annually in Prague honors physicians demonstrating extraordinary compassion during pandemics. Italian medical students now take oaths wearing replica masks to honor their predecessors' sacrifices. Most movingly, during COVID's peak, Barcelona nurses painted beak-shaped respirators with Renaissance motifs, bridging centuries of pestilence in a gesture of solidarity. Archaeological discoveries continue refining our understanding. Recent mass grave excavations using isotope analysis reveal plague doctors. Diets were surprisingly nutritious, suggesting municipalities prioritize keeping them healthy. Skeletal studies show their bones often bore signs of healed fractures from angry mobs. Most remarkably, DNA extracted from 17th century masks has identified pathogens beyond Yersinia, pesticina, proving smallpox and tuberculosis, proving these doctors battled multiple epidemics simultaneously. Their ethical dilemmas also resonate anew. Contemporary debates over healthcare rationing echo plague doctors' terrible choices about who received scarce treatments. The same moral exhaustion that led some medieval physicians to flee now appears in modern clinicians' early retirements. And just as plague doctors balanced financial incentives against Hippocratic oaths, today's pharmaceutical companies grapple with profit versus public good, perhaps. The ultimate lesson lies in recognizing plague doctors not as antiquated curiosities, but as professional ancestors. Their failures teach us the cost of clinging to dogma. Their occasional successes show observation's value even without proper frameworks. Most importantly, their perseverance, that stubborn refusal to abandon patients despite apocalyptic odds established. The physician's role we still idealize today as we face emerging threats from climate change-driven pathogens to antibiotic resistance. The plague doctor's legacy offers both warning and inspiration. Their story cautions against complacency. The Black Death killed indiscriminately across continents, just as COVID did. But it also demonstrates humanity's capacity to adapt, to learn, and ultimately to endure. In Prague's Church of Our Lady, before Tun, a small plaque honors an unknown plague doctor buried beneath its floors. The inscription reads, "To those who walk into darkness, carrying whatever light they have." This simple epitaph captures their true significance, not the frightening mask, but the fragile human behind it, who chose to serve when others fled. 7 centuries later, as new generations of healthcare workers dan their PPE against unknown threats, that light still burns.